Mr. White held his front door open. "Morris, come in, come in." Mr. White's old friend, Sergeant Major Morris, stepped inside. Mr. White led him into the parlor. Mrs. White and their grown son, Herbert, sat before a crackling fire. Morris settled into a chair. Mrs. White poured tea. "So good of you to come," said Mrs. White. "Thank you for inviting me." Morris looked around the parlor. "It's so warm here, so safe. I can almost forget about the mysterious jungles of India lurking right outside this house. I can almost believe life has returned to normal." "Normal?" Mr. White studied his old friend's face. He looked worried. Or did he look scared? "Has something happened to you, Morris?" asked Mr. White. Morris rubbed his hand across his chin. "My life has been nearly destroyed by a monkey's paw." "A monkey's paw?" Mr. White frowned. "I'm afraid I don't understand what you mean." Morris reached into his pocket and pulled out a dark object. It was a tiny, shriveled hand covered in fur. Mr. White peered down at the tiny hand. "Morris, this is the cause of all of your troubles? The withered paw of one small monkey?" "It's small and withered, yes," said Morris, "but it's powerful. It has a spell on it. This paw grants 3 wishes to anyone who owns it." "3 wishes?" Mrs. White looked at the paw. "It's magic, then." "You may call it magic," Morris said. "I call it cursed." "Cursed?" said Mrs. White. "But that's silly. How can a wish be cursed?" "Very easily," said Morris, shaking his head. "Whenever we make a wish, greed clouds our judgment." "I wouldn't let greed cloud my judgment," said Herbert. "I would think the whole thing through. I would know exactly what I was wishing for." "I thought I was smarter than the monkey's paw and its magic," Morris said. "I was wrong." "Then you've made your 3 wishes?" asked Mr. White. "I have," said Morris. "And if I had a 4th wish, I'd use it now. I'd wish with all my heart I'd never seen this paw. It's terrible, I tell you." Morris flung the monkey's paw into the fireplace. "No!" Herbert said. He grabbed a fire iron, and then he fished the monkey's paw from the flames and flipped it onto the parlor floor. "I can't watch you ruin your happy home." Morris rose to his feet. "You have a fine family and a good life." He told Mr. White, "If you want to keep them safe, you'll toss that cursed paw back into the flames." Mr. White walked Morris to the door. When Mr. White returned, Herbert said, "What should we wish for first?" "Nothing," said his father. Morris was right. "I live in a fine house with a family I love. I have nothing to wish for." "But this fine house isn't completely ours," said Mrs. White. "We still owe $200 to the bank. Wouldn't our good life and fine family be that much better without debt hanging over our heads? Think how happy you'd be to hand $200 to the banker, Papa," said Herbert. "I don't know," Mr. White said. "It would be nice to own this house." Mr. White stared at the monkey's paw. Then he took a deep breath. "I wish for $200. "Oh," said Mrs. White, "I saw it move. The monkey's paw moved." "I heard your wish, Papa," said Herbert. "Now the wish will come true." "Nonsense," said his father. "The wind just moved it. This monkey's paw is no more magic than I am." He scooped up the paw, and then he put it in his desk drawer. "Let's forget about this withered paw and go to bed." The next morning, though, Herbert had not forgotten. "The $200 may come today while I'm at work," he said, as he left his job at the factory. Don't spend it all before I get back." That evening, Herbert did not come home from work. Mrs. White was very worried. Then a knock sounded at the door. Mrs. White opened the door. A man from Herbert's factory stepped into the hall. "There's been an accident," the man told Mr. and Mrs. White. "Herbert was caught in the machinery at the factory. We couldn't save him." Mr. White stared at the man. "Herbert is dead?" The man nodded. "We hope this will ease your suffering a bit." He handed Mrs. White an envelope. Mrs. White's hand trembled as she opened it. Oh no." She flung the envelope to the floor. The packet from Herbert's factory contained $200. "Where is the paw?" Mrs. White ran into the parlor. "I put it away," Mr. White said. "Where can it do no more harm?" "But we have 2 more wishes," said Mrs. White. "We can wish him back. We can have our sweet Herbert back." "Do you really think that's wise?" said Mr. White. "After what's just happened, you believe anything good can come from our wishes?" "Don't you want your son back?" asked Mrs. White. "Of course I do," said Mr. White. He unlocked his desk drawer and pulled out the monkey's paw. He closed his eyes. "I wish for my son," he said. "I wish my son, Herbert, would come back." Thunder cracked outside the window. "It heard you," whimpered Mrs. White. "Our Herbert will come home." Mr. and Mrs. White heard footsteps outside. "Herbert," said Mrs. White. "I'd know the sound of his walk anywhere." She raced through the hall and flung open the front door. A tall figure stumbled toward her down the road. "Herbert," she said. Lightning flashed. Mrs. White saw her son clearly. "No!" Mrs. White screamed. "Oh no, it can't be." She stared at the figure in the road. It was Herbert, but not Herbert as he had been that morning. Mrs. White slammed the door. Mr. and Mrs. White heard Herbert's uneven steps. They heard his knocks on the door. Thump, thump, thump. "What have we done?" Mrs. White stumbled to the floor. Thump, thump, thump. "We have 1 wish left," said Mr. White. "I wish..." Thump, thump, thump. "I wish my son was dead," said Mr. White. The banging stopped. Mrs. White crept to the window and looked out. "He's gone," she whispered. "Our son is gone. And so are our wishes." Mr. White stared at the shriveled paw in his hands. "Along with our happy life." He staggered into the parlor and threw the monkey's paw into the fire. And this time, Herbert was not there to pull it out. Bill whistled a jazzy tune. Tonight's the night, he thought. He strolled through Central Park on his way to meet Sally, his best girl. There was still snow on the ground, but Bill could smell spring in the air. He jingled the engagement ring in his pocket. A June wedding would be just right. Bill saw Sally coming down the path towards him. He ran to her. He spun her around in his arms. Sally squealed with delight. Bill settled Sally back down onto the park bench. He kneeled on one knee in front of her. "Sally," Bill said, "you are the most beautiful girl I've ever met. I love you, and I want you to be my wife. Will you marry me?" Sally laughed and said, "Yes, I will marry you." As Bill gazed lovingly at his bride-to-be, his eyes lingered on the red velvet ribbon Sally always wore around her neck. "Why do you always wear that red ribbon?" Bill asked. Sally said, "Bill, I must never take off my red ribbon." Bill smiled at Sally and left the ribbon alone. Bill and Sally were married that June. Bill found a lovely little house in a nice neighborhood, and they moved in. Bill bought Sally many party dresses, but Sally always wore her red ribbon with each outfit. Bill thought this was odd. Sally just smiled and said, "I must never take off my red ribbon." After a few years, Sally found out that she was going to have a baby. This news delighted Bill. Sally talked with her friends who had babies. Bill talked with his buddies who had children. They talked together late into the night about what they had learned from everyone. When the big day came, Sally said, "Please tell the doctor I must not take off my red ribbon." Bill was frustrated, but he promised Sally that he would tell the doctor. After the baby was born, Bill gave Sally flowers. "Thank you for the flowers, Bill," Sally said, "and thank you for telling the doctor that I must never take off my red ribbon." Bill did not understand why the red ribbon was so important. "Do you want to hold little Billy?" Sally asked. Bill, Sally, and little Billy lived happily for many years in the small, lovely house in the nice neighborhood. When little Billy was a baby, he would sometimes reach for the red ribbon around his mother's neck. Sally would gently take his little hands in hers and coo at him, saying, "Mommy must never take off her red ribbon." The red ribbon had frustrated Bill for a long time. He loved Sally with all his heart, but did not understand her need to wear the red ribbon. After many years, Bill had an idea. "Our anniversary is coming up. I will buy Sally a beautiful necklace. She will take off that old red ribbon so she can wear the beautiful necklace." Their anniversary came. Bill took Sally to a fancy restaurant overlooking Central Park. They had a delicious meal. Then Bill gave Sally a velvet box with a beautiful diamond necklace in it. She opened it, smiled, and tears came to her eyes. Bill put the necklace around her neck and started to take off the red ribbon. Sally stopped him. She said, "I must never take off my red ribbon." Bill sat back in his seat with a huff. He looked at Sally and shook his head. "I may never understand," Bill said. Sally gently placed the diamond necklace back in the velvet box and closed the lid. "It is lovely, Bill, and I will treasure it always," she said. "But I must never take off my red ribbon." "Why?" Bill asked, as he had for so many years. Sally smiled, sadly, and shook her head. She did not answer him. Late that night, Bill was still awake. "I've loved Sally for more than 20 years, but she insists on wearing that horrible red ribbon around her neck. I think it's about time I find out why." Bill got out of bed and walked over around to Sally's side. Bill carefully pinched the ends of the bow on the ribbon. He began to slowly pull on the ribbon. The bow became smaller and smaller. The loops of the bow pulled through, and only a half knot was left. Bill slid his finger under the half knot and tugged. Zip! The ribbon gave way. Pop! Sally's head came off. It rolled right to the floor, bouncing in the moonlight. One large tear fell from Sally's eye. "I warned you," she said. "I must never take off my red ribbon." One night, in a small American town, a young girl threw a party and invited all her friends from school. There was a large group of boys and girls, and, as the night went on, they began telling scary stories. One boy said he had heard an urban legend about an old graveyard that was located near the girl's house. According to the story, an old woman had been buried in the middle of the cemetery, and there were rumors that she was a witch. They said that if someone stood on her grave at midnight, she would grab them and drag them down to hell. "I would never go near a graveyard after dark," another boy said. "You're all a bunch of morons," laughed the girl who owned the house. "It's just a silly superstition. I can't believe you'd take it seriously." The boy who had told the story turned to her and sneered. "It's all very well to be brave when you're safe and warm in your own home. I think you'd have a different attitude if you actually went to that graveyard." "It wouldn't make a difference," replied the girl. "Okay, prove it," said the boy. "We'll all go down to the cemetery and wait outside while you go in and stand on the old witch's grave." "A grave doesn't scare me," said the girl. "I'll do it right now." "You have to prove you really did it," said the boy. "Otherwise, you might chicken out." He took a knife from the kitchen drawer and handed it to her. "Stick this knife in the grave," he said. "Then we'll know you were there for sure." The group of kids set out for the graveyard, and when they reached the old iron gates, they gathered in a circle. All of them stared at the girl. She tried to pretend she wasn't scared, and she hoped they didn't see her shivering in fear. With the knife clutched tightly in her hand, the girl walked through the old iron gateway and made her way through the darkened graveyard. In the moonlight, the tombstones and the trees cast strange and unnerving shadows. Eventually, she came to the old woman's grave. "There is nothing to be scared of," the girl told herself. "It's just a stupid story." Crouching in front of the headstone, she whispered, "I'm not afraid of you." Then she raised the knife above her head and thrust it into the earth. "Take that, you old witch," she chuckled. The girl was about to turn and leave when she felt something holding her back. She couldn't move. Something was tugging on the hem of her dress and dragging her down. She was filled with fear and flew into a panic. "Help!" she cried. "She's got me! She's got me!" When she didn't come back, her friends began to get worried. After a while, they cautiously entered the graveyard to look for her. They found her sprawled across the old woman's grave. She was dead, and her face was frozen in a silent scream. Without realizing it, she had plunged the knife through her skirt and had pinned it to the ground. That's what had been holding her. The poor girl had been so terrified that her heart gave in, and she died of fright.